Ancestral Land Curse: The Price of Greed and Dark Powers. Episode 2. In a desperate bid to secure a piece of ancestral land believed to possess powerful energy, the Indian family falls victim to greed and dark forces that spiral out of control. Led by the unscrupulous Tung, they bribe, threaten, and desecrate sacred burial grounds to claim the land as their own. However, the land is cursed, and the supernatural retaliation begins almost immediately. Mr. Tung's family is torn apart by a series of haunting, inexplicable deaths that mirror the cruelty they inflicted on others. Despite multiple attempts to protect themselves with powerful rituals, the curse tightens its grip, leading to gruesome fates for each family member. Spirits of those wronged, including murdered ancestors and desecrated graves, rise to claim justice. As the terrifying events escalate, the family realizes too late that no one can escape the wrath of the curse. Part 1. The Land of Fortune. Mr. Tung stood at the edge of a vast stretch of land, his eyes glinting with a mixture of desire and ambition. This was no ordinary plot of earth. It was said to be sacred, steeped in ancient energies and holding secrets passed down through generations. The land lay nestled between a towering mountain and a winding river, a perfect balance of feng shui that made it an ideal spot for any family wishing for prosperity. Tung, a man driven by power, had coveted this land for as long as he could remember. The Indian family had owned it for centuries, their ancestors buried in the very soil that now called to Tung like a siren song. It wasn't just the land itself he wanted, but the fortune and future it promised. He believed that whoever controlled the land controlled their own destiny. For years he watched as the Indian family thrived. The air around him seemed to hum with ancient power, as though the land was aware of his presence, as though it knew what he intended. Tung stood taller, his chest rising with a swell of determination. He wouldn't be stopped by mere traditions or old family ties. The Nguyen family was weakening, their influence waning. They had grown comfortable, complacent, and Tung would seize this moment to strike. For months, Tung tried negotiating with the Nguyens, offering them riches beyond imagination if they would only part with the land. But they refused. Each time, their patriarch spoke the same words: "This land is not for sale. It belongs to our ancestors. It is sacred." The more they refused, the deeper Tung's envy grew, and with it, his frustration. How could they not see the opportunity before them? How could they cling so tightly to the past, ignoring the wealth and success he was offering? But Tung was not a man to give up easily. He wasn't the type to accept defeat, especially not from a family he believed was undeserving of the power they held. So, in the dead of night, Tung turned to darker methods. He sought out Zon, the village sorcerer, a man feared for his mastery over dark rituals and ancient spells. Sun was a mysterious figure, rarely seen by daylight, known for his power to bend the spirits of the earth and air to his will. Rumors swirl about his ability to commune with forces long forgotten by the modern world, forces that could either grant life or snuff it out with ease. Tung approached Sun under the cover of night, the weight of his ambition pulling at every step. As he entered the sorcerer's dwelling, he felt a chill creep down his spine. The air inside was thick, heavy with the scent of burning herbs, and something far more sinister. Shadows danced along the walls, moving in rhythm with the low hum of Sun's voice as he chanted an ancient incantation. Sun's eyes gleamed as Tung explained his desires, laying bare his plan to take the Nguyen's land. "I want what is rightfully mine," Tung declared, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and anticipation. Sun listened in silence, his weathered hands tracing symbols in the air. When Tung finished, the sorcerer's lips curled into a smile that sent a shiver through the room. "The land you seek." Sun rasped, his voice low and rough, is guarded by forces older than time itself. "You cannot take it without their permission." "But I can help you." Tung's heart raced at the sorcerer's words, but there was an edge of unease in his excitement. Sun's grin widened, revealing teeth as sharp as his gaze. "You must be prepared to pay a price though. The spirits of the land do not give freely." Tung hesitated for only a moment. his ambition burning brighter than any fear. "What do I need to do?" he asked, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Sun nodded, pleased with Tung's determination. "A ritual," the sorcerer replied, "one that will awaken the spirits and bend them to your will. But be warned, once awakened, they may not be so easily controlled." The warnings did little to deter Tung. He had come too far to turn back now. With every passing day, the thought of the land consumed him, driving him to the edge of madness. He agreed to the ritual, sealing his fate with a single nod. The night of the ritual was one of oppressive silence. The village seemed to hold its breath as Tung and Sun made their way to the outskirts of the Nguyen property. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale, sickly glow over the landscape. Sun instructed Tung to stand at the center of the burial ground, where generations of Nguyen ancestors lay in eternal rest. As Tung positioned himself, he couldn't shake the feeling that thousands of eyes were watching him from beneath the soil. Sun began the ritual, his voice rising and falling in a hypnotic cadence. The ground trembled beneath Tung's feet as the air grew colder, the temperature dropping so quickly that Tung could see his breath forming in front of him. The wind howled, but it was not the wind of nature, it was something else, something darker, more malevolent. The spirits had awoken. Suddenly, the earth beneath Tung's feet began to shift. The graves of the Nguyen ancestors groaned as the ground split open, revealing the ancient bones of those who had been laid to rest. A powerful force surged through the air, and Tung felt it wrap around him like a vice. His chest tightened, and his heart raced as an overwhelming sense of dread washed over him. And then came the whispers. Low at first, like the rustling of leaves, they grew louder, more insistent. They spoke in a language Tung didn't understand, but the meaning was clear. They were angry, furious, betrayed. Tung tried to back away, but his feet were rooted to the spot, held in place by an unseen force. He could feel their hatred, their contempt for what he had done. The spirits of the land, once at peace, were now awake, and they would not rest until justice was served. Sun's voice faltered for a moment as the energy around them intensified, the air crackling with power. Tung's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the ritual pressing down on him. He had unleashed something far greater than he had anticipated, something far beyond his control. The land, the power, the prosperity he had sought, it all seemed insignificant now in the face of the ancient fury that surrounded him. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the ritual ended. The air stilled, the ground ceased to shake, and the whispers faded into silence. But the damage had been done. The spirits were awake, and they would not forget. Tung stood in the center of the disturbed graves, his body trembling with fear and adrenaline. He had gotten what he wanted, the land was his. But at what cost? As he turned to leave, the shadows seemed to move with him, following his every step, their presence a constant reminder of the price he had paid. The land of fortune was now his, but it was far from the victory he had imagined. He was cursed, and the spirits of the ancestors would make sure he never forgot it. Tung's ambition had brought him to the land, but it was greed that would destroy him. This rewritten version builds on the original idea, but adds more dramatic flair, horror, and emotional expression. It emphasizes Tung's ambition. Part 2, a desecrated grave. The moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the land as Tung made his way back from the latest ritual. His heart, usually beating with confidence after each of his dark incantations, now fluttered with a strange unease. The night was unnaturally silent, as if the very air around him was holding its breath, waiting for something. He shook off the feeling, convincing himself that it was just his mind playing tricks after the intensity of the ritual. After all, the land was his now, wasn't it? As Tung walked through the familiar stretch of his newly claimed territory, the dense fog rolled across the ground, thick and unnerving. His feet dragged, as though the earth itself was pulling him back, urging him to turn around to leave. Yet he pressed on. He had to see the burial grounds, the place where his ancestors lay, the very heart of the land's power. But something felt wrong. When he reached the graves, an icy chill slid down his spine, rooting him to the spot. His breath hitched in his throat as he blinked, trying to make sense of what lay before him. His knees buckled under the weight of the side bones, scattered like discarded rubbish, stretched across the burial ground. The earth had been torn open, the graves of his ancestors desecrated, as if some monstrous force had clawed its way through the soil. Coffins lay exposed, their lids thrown aside like they held no meaning, no respect. The remains of those who had once protected the land were now scattered, broken and discarded. Tung's vision blurred as he took in the horror. His father's bones, his grandfather's skull, the remnants of generations who had once stood strong, now lay in pieces, carelessly strewn across the cold ground. His hands trembled as he knelt before his father's grave, tears streaming uncontrollably down his face. His lips quivered as he reached out, his fingertips barely grazing a bone. "Father." Grandfather's voice cracked, the words barely a whisper, swallowed by the oppressive silence of the night. Tung collapsed fully, his body shaking with sobs, his mind unable to grasp the magnitude of what he was seeing. While he gasped, his voice trembling with disbelief. "What have we done to deserve this?" he screamed into the night, his anguish echoing through the cold, still air. His voice, once full of confidence and authority, was now broken and weak, reduced to the cries of a man who had lost everything. His screams faded, and the silence returned heavier than before. The night itself seemed to mock him, offering no answer, no solace. For a moment Tung sat frozen in place, his knees buried in the cold dirt, his hands gripping the earth as though he could pull his ancestors back from the grave. But no matter how hard he clawed at the ground, the bones remained, a testament to the destruction he had wrought. The land, once vibrant with life and energy, he had defiled the sacred ground. The weight of his greed and ambition now hung over him like a shroud, suffocating him with guilt. He had sought power through dark rituals, thinking he could control the forces of the land. But in his arrogance he had failed to see the price that would be paid. The spirits of his ancestors, those who had protected the land for generations, had been disturbed, angered by his desecration. Tung felt their rage now, a cold, suffocating presence that settled over him. His body trembled as the realization struck him like a hammer to the chest. The dead were no longer at rest. They were furious, their spirits awakened by the foul magic he had used to claim the land. He had unleashed something far worse than he could have ever imagined. A sudden gust of wind swept through the burial grounds, cold and biting, as if it carried with it the breath of the dead. The wind, Tung's heart raced as the darkness closed in around him. Every instinct screamed for him to run, to flee from the place that had once been his greatest desire. But his legs were heavy, rooted to the cursed soil that he had so desperately wanted to control. The shadows crept closer, the air growing colder with each passing second. He could feel them, his ancestors circling him, their whispers just beyond his comprehension. "Forgive me," Tung choked out, his voice barely audible over the wail of the wind. I didn't know, I didn't understand, but there was no forgiveness here." The dead did not care for apologies. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, pressing against his skull until it felt like his head would split open. They spoke in a language he couldn't understand, but the meaning was clear. They were here to punish him, to reclaim what he had stolen. He had broken the sacred bond between the living and the dead, and now he would pay. Suddenly the wind stopped. The air around him grew still, unnaturally so. The fog thickened, closing in around Tung like a suffocating blanket. He gasped for air, his chest tightening as a cold sweat broke out across his skin. He felt eyes on him, 1,000 unseen eyes watching his every move, waiting for the moment to strike. And then, from the darkness, a voice, low and guttural, rose from the ground. "You have desecrated this land." The voice was not human, it was ancient, otherworldly, filled with a depth of hatred that made Tung's blood run cold. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the earth, from the sky, from the very bones that lay scattered around him. Tung's breath caught in his throat as he tried to stand, but his legs gave way beneath him, sending him crashing to the ground once more. "You sought power," the voice continued, growing louder. The last thing Tung saw before the darkness consumed him entirely was the twisted, skeletal face of his father, staring at him from the ground, eyes hollow and accusing. And then silence. Tung's ambition had led him to claim the land, but it was his greed that had brought his downfall. The land of fortune was now his, but it was cursed, and the spirits would ensure he never escaped their wrath. The price of his greed had been paid in full. Part 3. The haunting begins. It started as a faint whisper, barely noticeable at first, just a flicker of movement in the periphery of Mr. Tung's vision. The shadows danced at the edges of his home, harmless enough in the beginning, easily dismissed as tricks of the light or the stress of his growing empire. Tung brushed it off, convinced that his mind was playing games after the land acquisition and the bizarre events at the burial ground. The nights, however, began to feel longer, the silence of the house oppressive, as though the walls themselves were closing in. Mrs. Tung was the first to notice. She would wake at night, her chest tight, feeling as though someone or something was watching her. At first it was the odd creaking of the wooden floorboards that unsettled her, the distinct sound of footsteps echoing down the halls when no one was there. But soon it escalated. Whispers, soft at first like the wind rustling through the trees, began to fill the house at night. They would rise from the darkness, slithering into her ears, incoherent but undeniably sinister. "Do you hear that?" she whispered to Tom one night, her voice trembling, the blankets pulled up to her chin as her eyes darted nervously around the room. "Hear what?" Tom asked, half asleep, irritation creeping into his tone. He had no time for such nonsense. "The voices," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "They come every night. They're here. I can hear them," whispering. Tom huffed, dismissing her fears with a wave of his hand. "You're imagining things," he muttered, turning over in bed. "Go back to sleep." But the voices didn't go away. In fact, they grew louder. The small flickers of shadows soon became darker, more defined. They crept along the walls, moving in ways that defied natural light. Mrs. Tung would see them in the corners of her eyes as she went about her day, their twisted forms vanishing the moment she tried to focus on them. The air inside their once lively home grew heavy, thick with an energy that pressed down on everyone. It felt as though the house itself was suffocating. And then the deaths began. The first worker, a man in his early 30s, was found one morning at the sawmill. Rumors began to swirl among the workers. They whispered about the land, about how it had never been meant for the living. Some spoke of curses, others of vengeful spirits. Most refused to work after dark, fearing that the shadows would come for them next. Tung, ever the pragmatist, tried to quell the panic. He hired more workers, paying them handsomely, but the deaths continued. No matter how much money he threw at the problem, nothing seemed to stem the tide of bloodshed. Dark figures were seen lurking just beyond the edges of the sawmill, standing motionless near the trees, their faces obscured by the night. Yet, when approached, they would vanish, leaving nothing but a chill in the air and a sense of deep, unshakable dread. And then Mrs. Tung fell ill. It began slowly, with bouts of dizziness and fatigue, but soon her health deteriorated at an alarming rate. She would lie in bed, shivering, her once vibrant face now pale and gaunt. She complained of the cold even when the room was warm. Her skin seemed to grow thinner by the day, stretched tight over her bones, as if her very life was being drained away. Dark circles formed beneath her eyes, and she would stare blankly into the distance, as if seeing something no one else could. "I can feel them," she whispered one night, her voice weak, her eyes wide with terror as she clutched the bedsheets. "They're here, watching me. I can feel them." Waiting Tone, now desperate, called for doctors, healers, anyone who could possibly help his wife. But no matter what they did, Mrs. Tong grew weaker, her vitality slipping away as though a dark force was tightening its grip around her. The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, was now cold and silent. The servants moved about with downcast eyes, whispering amongst themselves about the strange happenings, but none dared speak of it to Tom. The once mighty patriarch of the household now seemed smaller, haunted by the very things he refused to believe in. One night, as Tom sat by his wife's bedside, watching her chest rise and fall with shallow breaths, the whispers returned. This time, they weren't distant. They were right there, in the room with him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he heard it, a voice, low and guttural, speaking his name, Tung. His heart stopped. He looked around the room, but no one was there. The shadows clung to the corners, growing darker, thicker, as though they were waiting to pounce. Tung, you took what wasn't yours. The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding him, filling the room with a cold, malevolent presence. His blood ran cold as he realized that this was no longer just a haunting. It was a reckoning. Tung's hands trembled as he gripped the armrest of the chair, his knuckles white with fear. He wanted to flee, to run as far away from the house as possible, but he couldn't leave his wife. Not like this. Mrs. Tung stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked up at him, her face ashen, her breath labored. Tung, she rasped, barely able to speak. You have to stop them. Stop who? He asked, his voice shaking. The spirits. The ones you angered, she whispered, her eyes glassy with fear. They're coming for us. They won't stop until we're all dead. A sudden gust of wind swept through the room, despite the windows being closed. The curtains billowed, and the temperature plummeted. Tung's breath came out in visible puffs as the air turned icy. He could feel them now, spirits, cold and angry, swirling around the room, their presence undeniable. In that moment he knew this wasn't just about the land. It wasn't about wealth or power. It was about the debt he owed, a debt that could only be paid in blood. The haunting had on Part 4. Ancestral spirits awaken. Tung's desperation clawed at his soul like a wild animal trapped in a cage. Every breath he took was filled with dread, as if the very air around him had thickened with the presence of something dark and ancient. The nightmares had grown unbearable, vivid, terrifying visions of his ancestors, their faces twisted in rage, their skeletal hands reaching out from the darkness, pulling him into a void where no light could penetrate. His nights were haunted by the anguished screams of the dead, their cold whispers seeping into his mind, driving him to the brink of madness. Unable to endure the torment any longer, Tung sought out the help of a shaman known for his dealings with the spirit world. This shaman, an elderly man with deep-set eyes that seemed to hold secrets from beyond the veil, lived in a secluded village far from Tung's home. As Tung entered the shaman's humble dwelling, the scent of burning incense and herbs hung heavy in the air. The walls were lined with ancient talismans, charms, and strange markings that Tung didn't recognize. The flickering light from the candles cast eerie shadows across the room, making the space feel otherworldly. The shaman sat cross-legged on a worn mat, his face hidden beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. His long, gnarled fingers methodically moved through the air, as if drawing invisible lines of energy that only he could see. Tung's heart pounded in his chest as he took a seat before the shaman, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and urgency. "I need your help," he said, the words coming out more like a plea than a command. "The spirits, my ancestors, they won't leave me in peace." They're angry. The shaman remained silent for a moment, his head tilted slightly, as if listening to something only he could hear. Then, without looking up, he spoke, his voice a low, gravelly murmur. "They are angry because they have been wronged." Tung's throat tightened. He knew exactly what the shaman meant, but hearing it spoken aloud made his stomach churn. "What do I need to do?" he asked, though the answer already gnawed at the edges of his mind. Finally, the shaman raised his head, his eyes locking onto Tung's with a piercing gaze that seemed to look straight through him, into his very soul. "You've disturbed the sacred," the shaman said, his voice heavy with an ominous tone. "The dead do not rest easily when their graves are desecrated. The spirits you've awakened are not merely the souls of your ancestors. They are ancient forces bound to the land. By disrupting their eternal slumber, you have invoked their wrath." A cold shiver ran down Tung's spine. He had expected something like this, but hearing the words spoken by the shaman brought an overwhelming sense of dread that he hadn't been prepared for. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, suffocating him with the realization of what he had done. "Is there any way to stop them?" Tung's voice cracked, betraying the fear that he had tried so hard to keep at bay. "What must I do to make them leave us The shaman's eyes narrowed, his lips pressing into a thin line. The spirits are bound to the land, and the land is bound to you. They seek justice for what was taken. You cannot simply appease them with offerings or rituals. You have unleashed an ancient force, one that cannot be easily placated. Tung's pulse quickened. His hands clenched into fists as he tried to maintain control of his rising panic. I'll return the land. I'll make things right. I'll do whatever it takes. The shaman shook his head slowly, a deep sadness in his gaze. It may already be too late. The balance has been broken. The spirits seek retribution, not reconciliation. Tung's mind reeled. Too late? No, it couldn't be. There had to be something he could do. He had built his entire life on this land, sacrificed everything to secure it. He couldn't simply surrender to the whims of the dead. There must be a way, Tung insisted, his voice rising with desperation. I can't just give up. Tell me what I can do. The shaman sighed, his shoulders slumping as though burdened by the spirits of your ancestors have risen from their graves. The shaman continued, his voice growing more intense, more foreboding with each word. They are not like the ghosts of the living. They are bound to the land, fueled by the power of the earth itself. You have awakened them, and now they seek justice. But their justice is not like ours. It is ancient, primal. They will stop at nothing until they have claimed what was taken. Tung's heart pounded in his chest as the shaman's words sank in. His mind raced, grasping for some way out, some solution that would allow him to escape the nightmare that had been set into motion. I'll give them whatever they want, Tung said quickly, his voice shaking with fear. I'll return the land, I'll give offerings, anything, but the shaman's gaze remained unflinching. It may be too late for that. The spirits are no longer tied to the material world in the way you think. They are beyond such offerings now. They seek more than just a physical exchange. They want reparation in the form of your very essence, the life you took from the earth when you claimed what wasn't yours. Tung felt the walls closing in around him. The room felt smaller, darker, as if the shadows themselves were conspiring to swallow him whole. His skin prickled with the icy touch of something unseen, a cold hand brushing against his back, sending shivers down his spine. He tried to steady his breathing, but the weight of his fear was too much. Is there no way to stop them? Tung's voice was barely a whisper now, his lips trembling. The shaman's face softened, but his eyes remained grave. The only way to stop them would be to return what was taken, to restore the balance you destroyed. But even if you do that, the spirits may still demand the sacrifice. Tung's mind spun. The shaman nodded slowly. You cannot run from the dead. They will find you no matter where you go. Tung closed his eyes, his chest tight with the weight of his impending doom. The land he had fought so hard to claim, the land he had sacrificed everything for, had turned on him. And now, the very ground beneath his feet would become his grave. With that final thought, Tung stood, his body trembling. He felt the pull of the spirits, their cold fingers brushing against his soul, beckoning him to face the consequences of his actions. There was no escape. He had to face the wrath of the dead, or lose everything: his family, his legacy, and perhaps even his soul. Part 5. The Dark Curse. The air in Mr. Tung's home had grown thick with dread. The shaman had come and gone, performing his cleansing ritual, but something felt wrong, terribly wrong. The smell of incense still lingered, the faint scent of burning sage mingling with the ever-present stench of fear. Tung stood alone in the center of his family's once grand living room, staring at the fading symbols the shaman had drawn in ash on the walls. The soft glow of the ritual candles barely lit the room, casting long shadows that twisted and danced across the walls like the spirits themselves. The shaman's words echoed in Tung's mind: the spirits cannot be appeased. They are too far gone. Tung had paid him well, desperate for a solution, but deep down he knew it had been futile. No amount of money or ritual could turn back the tide of darkness that had swept over his family. The curse had been unleashed, and now it was hungry for blood, hungry for souls. It started slowly, like a creeping sickness, spreading through the household. First it had claimed his youngest son, Hoi, a bright boy with a future full of promise. Hoi had always been the pride of Tung's family. But one evening, he simply vanished. He had been playing outside with his brothers near the edge of the land, just as he had done countless times before. As the days wore on, the house grew quieter, but the air grew heavier, charged with the sensation that something malevolent lurked just beyond the veil of the physical world. At first it was subtle objects moving on their own, whispers in the dead of night, shadows flickering in the corners of their vision. But the malevolence grew bolder, more brazen with each passing day. Tung's other sons began to suffer. Duke, his eldest, fell ill suddenly. He had always been a robust, strong young man, full of vitality and ambition. But one morning, Tung found Duke lying motionless in his bed, his face contorted into an unnatural grimace of pain and terror. His skin was pale, his lips blue, as if the life had been sucked out of him in his sleep. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of a fight, yet the expression on his face suggested that whatever had taken him had been beyond mortal comprehension. A doctor was called, but no explanation could be found. Days later, Tung's third son, Min, vanished under similarly mysterious circumstances. One moment, he was sitting at the dining table with the family, eating dinner and laughing as though nothing was wrong. The next, he was gone. His chair was overturned, his food left untouched, and the room was filled with an eerie, suffocating silence. There had been no sound, no struggle, yet simply disappeared, leaving nothing behind but a chilling emptiness. Tung's wife grew more and more hysterical as the days passed. She would wander the halls, calling out to her lost sons, her voice raw with anguish. Her body grew frail, her eyes hollow. The weight of their losses had taken a toll on her spirit, and Tung feared it wouldn't be long before the curse claimed her too. Despite the looming terror, Tung refused to leave the land. He had poured his life into it, sacrificed everything for it. Each night, Tung lay awake in his bed, his mind racing with thoughts of what had gone wrong. He had believed he could control the dark forces he had unleashed, that he could harness the power of the land without consequence. But now, as the curse consumed his family one by one, he realized the terrible mistake he had made. He had underestimated the power of the spirits, and now they were taking their revenge. The days blurred together, each one. It started with the sound a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from deep within the earth. Tung and his brothers had been sitting in the living room, their conversation tense and strained, when the growl echoed through the house. They froze, eyes wide with fear, as the ground beneath them began to tremble. The candles flickered wildly, casting twisted shadows across the walls. Before Tung could react, a powerful force slammed into the room, shattering windows and throwing furniture across the floor. His brothers screamed, their voices filled with terror as they were dragged from their seats by invisible hands. Tung watched, helpless, as his brothers were pulled toward the dark corners of the room, their bodies contorted in agony. As Tung tried to move, tried to save them, but his body felt heavy, paralyzed by an overwhelming sense of dread. He could only watch as his brothers were ripped from this world, dragged into the darkness by the same malevolent force that had claimed his sons. The room was filled with the sound of their screams that would haunt Tung for the rest of his life. When it was over, the silence was deafening. The air was thick with the scent of blood and death. Tung stood alone in the wreckage of his home, his heart pounding in his chest. His brothers were gone, their bodies vanished without a trace. The curse had taken them, just as it had taken his sons. Tung sank to his knees, tears streaming down his face as the full weight of his actions crashed down on him. The curse he had unleashed in his quest for power had turned on him, devouring everything he had ever loved. His family was gone, claimed by the very darkness he had summoned. The land that had once promised prosperity and power was now soaked in the blood of his family. Part 6. Mrs. Tung's Fate. The house had become a tomb long before Mrs. Tung's final breath. What was once a home filled with the chatter of family had descended into an oppressive silence, broken only by her occasional wails of agony. The vibrant woman who once bustled around the kitchen, tending to her children, had withered away into a shell of her former self. Confined to her bed, her eyes no longer sparkled with life, but were clouded by terror and exhaustion. Her skin, once healthy, was pale and translucent, stretched tightly over her emaciated frame like parchment. Her bones jutted out unnaturally, making her look more like a corpse than a living being. The nights were the worst. As soon as darkness fell, the house seemed to come alive with unseen malevolence. The walls creaked as if they were straining under the weight of something heavy, something not of this world. Cold drafts moved through the rooms like invisible fingers, and shadows darted in the corners of every room, never staying long enough to be fully seen, but always there, lingering just beyond the edge of Tung's vision. Mrs. Tung's condition worsened rapidly, with each passing day. Her screams more frequent, her nights more tortured. She was no longer able to sleep. Each time she closed her eyes, the nightmares came, pulling her deeper into a world of suffering. She saw them her dead relatives, their skeletal faces twisted in anger, their bony hands reaching for her, scratching at her skin, gripping her throat, trying to drag her down into the abyss with them. "They won't let me rest," she sobbed one night, clutching the thin sheets around her as if they could protect her from the spirits. Her voice was frail, a mere whisper compared to the strength it once held. She turned her hollow eyes toward her husband, searching for comfort, but finding none. "They're angry," she continued, her voice trembling with fear. "They know what we've done, and they won't forgive us." Tung sat at her bedside, his hands shaking as he tried to reassure her. But he could see the truth in her eyes. He knew the curse had consumed her, and there was nothing he could do to save her. The spirits were beyond his control, and now they were taking their vengeance in the most horrifying way possible. At first it had seemed like madness, a fevered mind unraveling under the weight of grief. But Tung knew better now. He had seen the shadows too, had felt the cold touch of death creeping closer. He had heard the whispers that slithered through the house, voices not belonging to the living. The spirits had claimed their sons, his brothers, and now they were coming for her. Each night Mrs. Tung's screams echoed through the house, growing more desperate as the spirits closed in on her. She spoke of things Tung dared not believe, how the dead would appear at her bedside, their faces decayed, their mouths moving as if trying to speak, but only silence emerged. Their hands clawed at her, trying to pull her from the bed, to drag her into the grave where she belonged. One evening, as the rain poured relentlessly outside, Mrs. Tung's screams reached a fever pitch. The sound was primal, filled with such terror that Tung's blood cold. He was in the study when he heard it, a scream that seemed to come from deep within her soul. He bolted from his chair, his heart pounding in his chest as he sprinted down the hallway toward their bedroom. The storm outside howled, the wind rattling the windows and shaking the house to its foundation. Thunder boomed overhead as lightning illuminated the corridors in sharp, fleeting flashes, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move and shift on their own. Tung's breath came in ragged gasps as he threw open the door to the bedroom. What he saw inside froze him in place. Mrs. Tung's body was contorted into an unnatural shape, twisted in ways that should not have been possible. Her limbs were bent at horrifying angles, as if they had been snapped and broken by some unseen force. Her once soft, warm face was now frozen in a grotesque expression of pure horror, her mouth wide open in a silent scream, her eyes bulging with fear, staring blankly at the ceiling. Her skin, already pale, had turned a sickly grey, and her fingers were curled into claws, as though she had been trying to fend off something that had come for her. Tung stumbled backward, his knees buckling beneath him as he collapsed onto the floor. His chest heaved, but no sound came from his throat. His heart raced as he tried to make sense of the scene before him, but there was nothing left to understand. She was gone, taken by the curse, by the spirits she had tried so desperately to escape. The room felt colder than ever, a suffocating chill that seeped into Tung's bones. The air was thick, heavy with the weight of death. He could feel it. Something else was in the room with him, watching, waiting. The shadows in the corners seemed darker, denser, as though they were alive, pulsing with malevolent energy. He knew what had happened. He knew the spirits had claimed her, just as they had claimed her, just as they had claimed his sons, his brothers. Mrs. Tung had been marked for death the moment she had set foot on the cursed land, and now, in her final moments, The spirits had come to take her away. Tung could still hear her voice echoing in his mind, her last words spoken in terror, they're angry. They won't let me rest. The truth was undeniable now. The curse had consumed everything it touched, and there was no escape. The spirits had reason to exact their revenge, and they would not stop until every last member of Tung's family was gone. He stared at her lifeless body for what felt like an eternity, paralyzed by grief and fear. The storm outside continued to rage, the wind howling like the spirits themselves, furious and relentless. Rain lashed against the windows, the sound mixing with the low rumble of thunder that seemed to shake the very walls. As Tung crawled forward, reaching out to touch his wife's cold, stiff hand, a wave of nausea hit him. He couldn't look away from her twisted, broken form. Her suffering was over, but his had just begun. The curse was not done with him, yet it had only begun to feast on his despair. As Tung stood in the dim light of the room, he could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on him, suffocating him. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows creeping closer, darker, more oppressive. He could hear the whispers again, soft, sinister, echoing through the house. They were not done with him. The curse had taken his sons, his brothers, and now his wife. He was the last one left, and the spirits were coming for him. There would be no mercy, no escape. The land that had once been his dream had become his nightmare, a place where the dead would never rest, and neither would he. With one last grief-stricken glance at his wife's twisted form, Tom knew the truth. He had lost everything. The curse had consumed. Part 7. The curse strikes Tung. Tung had always been a man who commanded power. From the bustling sawmills to the growing fields, his empire had flourished for years. His hands had built wealth, but they had also stolen it, crushing others beneath his ambition. Yet now, the empire he had so carefully crafted was unraveling, piece by piece. What once stood tall and impenetrable was crumbling before his eyes, and no amount of control could stop the rot that had seeped into his fortune. It started with the smallest of cracks. The first sawmill he ever built caught fire in the dead of night, flames rising high into the sky, turning the once proud structure into a heap of smoldering ashes. The workers whispered about curses, about spirits of the dead angered by what Tung had done. They left in droves, refusing to return even when he promised them higher wages. Fear had spread through the village. Next came the drought. The land that had once been rich with crops, the soil that had birthed abundance, turned barren. Weeks passed, and the skies remained a relentless blue, not a drop of rain in sight. His crops withered under the unforgiving sun, and the promises of a prosperous future faded. Every attempt to save the fields ended in failure. Even the finest engineers and experts he hired to resolve the issue seemed to have no solution, shrugging in defeat. Tung's wealth, his power, his influence, all the things that had once defined him were slipping through his fingers like sand. The businesses that had made him a feared and respected man began to fail one by one. His accounts, once brimming with gold, were now drained, lost to bad investments, failed partnerships, and bizarre accidents that no one could explain. Everywhere he turned, there were signs of the curse. Shadows seemed to linger longer in the corners of his once grand mansion. Mirrors cracked without cause, their broken shards reflecting twisted versions of Tung's face. Strange noises echoed through the halls at night, whispers, footsteps, the soft creak of doors opening on their own. His servants left, their eyes wide with terror, muttering prayers under their breath as they packed their things, leaving him alone in the vast, decaying house. Tung's health began to falter. He was once strong, full of life, but now he could feel the weight of death pressing down on him. He looked in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back at him. His skin was pallid, his eyes sunken, and deep lines etched across his face as though the years had caught up to him all at once. His hands trembled constantly, and his breath came in short, ragged gasps, as if the air around him had turned toxic. But it wasn't just his body that was breaking, it was his mind too. He could feel the darkness creeping in at the edges, a constant shadow that whispered to him in his moments of solitude. He tried to ignore it at first, telling himself that it was just stress, just the weight of his crumbling fortune. But deep down he knew the truth. The curse was real. It had started with the land, the sacred ancestral grounds he had so ruthlessly claimed. He had thought he could control it, that he could manipulate the power of the spirits for his own gain. But the spirits had been waiting, biding their time, and now they had risen, their anger unleashed upon him and everything he held dear. His brothers were gone, swallowed by the darkness of the curse. His sons, his legacy, had been claimed one by one, their deaths unnatural and gruesome, their faces twisted in fear. Now Tung was alone, no family, no friends, no wealth, no power, only the curse remained, a constant presence that gnawed at his soul, hollowing him out from the inside. In his final act of desperation, he decided to return to the land that had started it all. He had avoided it for so long, unable to face the graveyard where his ancestors' bones had been scattered like trash, desecrated by his greed. But now he had no choice. He had to confront what he had done. He had to beg for forgiveness. The journey to the ancestral land was slow and painful. Tung's legs felt like lead, every step a reminder of the weight of the curse that clung to him. The once familiar path through the woods was overgrown and twisted, as though the land itself had turned against him. The trees seemed to loom over him, their branches reaching down like skeletal fingers, ready to claim him. By the time he reached the burial grounds, the sky had darkened. Thick, black clouds swirled overhead, casting long shadows across the land. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and the wind howled through the trees like a chorus of the damned. It felt as though Tung fell to his knees before the graves, his body shaking with sobs. The bones of his ancestors lay scattered before him, bleached white by the sun, still exposed to the elements after all this time. He could almost hear their voices, whispering in the wind, their anger palpable. I was wrong, Tung choked, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. I was wrong to disturb this sacred place. I was blinded by greed, by power. I thought I could control it, but I was a fool. Please, forgive me. He bowed his head, pressing his forehead to the cold, hard earth. He stayed like that for what felt like hours, his heart pounding in his chest, waiting for some sign that the spirits had heard him, that they would grant him mercy. But there was only silence. The wind picked up, tearing through the trees with a fury Tung had never experienced before. The sky above him churned, the black clouds thickening, blocking out the last remaining slivers of light. The air grew colder, and the ground beneath him began to tremble. Suddenly Tung felt something cold and wet on the back of his neck. He raised his head just in time to see a figure standing in the distance. It was a shadow barely visible in the fading light, but it was unmistakable. The figure was tall, cloaked in darkness, and it was watching him. Tung's breath caught in his throat. He blinked, and the figure was gone, swallowed by the storm. But the terror that gripped his heart did not fade. He knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. The curse was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike again. He staggered to his feet, his legs weak and trembling. He had come here for forgiveness, but the spirits had offered none. They had taken everything from him, and they would not stop until he was gone too. Tung turned and began to walk away, but the land did not let him leave so easily. The wind howled louder, pushing him back, and the ground shook beneath his feet, cracks spidering out from the graves, spreading across the land like a web. The bones of his ancestors rattled in their shallow graves as though they were reaching for him, trying to pull him back. He stumbled, falling to the ground once again. His heart raced, his vision blurring as he tried to crawl away to escape the land that had become his nightmare. But there was no escape. The curse had claimed him, just as it had claimed his family. And now it would claim his life. As the storm raged around him, Tung let out one final, desperate scream. The wind swallowed it whole, carrying it away into the night. Part 8. The Final Confrontation. Tung stumbled through the dense forest, his breath ragged, his eyes wild with fear. The towering trees closed in on him, their skeletal branches reaching out like gnarled hands, as if the land itself had come alive to swallow him whole. His feet, dragging through the mud and fallen leaves, arced from the frantic journey, but he could not stop. He dared not stop. The shadows that had haunted him for weeks were now everywhere, surrounding him, waiting for him to falter. The shaman's hut lay just ahead. His heart pounded in his chest as he reached the hut. The shaman's eyes finally opened, dark and unreadable, like deep pools that had seen too much. He let out a long sigh, the kind that spoke of ancient wisdom, of knowledge that weighed heavily on the soul. "This curse," the shaman began, his voice low and steady, "is older than you, older than your family, older than the land itself. It is a force that has been awakened by greed, by desecration, and it has grown beyond your control. It has its own will now. You cannot stop it." Tung's chest heaved with sobs, his fingers digging into his hair as he pulled at it in frustration, in agony. Tears streamed down his cheeks, hot and bitter, as his vision blurred. His once strong, proud form now hunched over, broken by the weight of his actions. "I only wanted to secure our future," he choked out between sobs. "I wanted my family to be safe, to be prosperous. I didn't know you didn't care," the shaman interrupted coldly, his voice sharp and cutting. "You did not care about the consequences when you sought to take what was not yours. You thought you could bend the spirits to your will. Now they have come for what is rightfully theirs." Tung's mind raced, the memories of the last few months playing in a relentless loop. His brothers, his sons, each one of them gone, taken by the darkness he had unleashed. His wife, her body twisted and broken by the curse that had invaded their home. His fortune, his lands, everything he had built had been reduced to ruin, and now all that was left was him, alone, hunted. "There must be something," Tung pleaded, his voice barely above a whisper. "There must be a way to undo this. You can help me. You can stop it." The shaman shook his head slowly, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames that danced in the darkened room. "No," he said, his tone filled with the weight of inevitability. "This curse is beyond my power. Even if I wanted to help you, there is nothing that can be done. It has taken root in the land, in the very bones of your ancestors. You cannot run from it. You cannot hide. It will find you." Tung's body shook with sobs as he collapsed fully to the floor, his forehead pressed against the cold wood, his tears soaking into the planks. The air in the hut seemed to thicken, growing colder, as if the spirits were drawing nearer, their presence now palpable, suffocating. The flickering candlelight dimmed, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls that twisted and writhed like tortured souls. "I'm sorry," Tung whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm so sorry." But his apology was swallowed by the night, by the cold, uncaring wind that howled outside, rattling the fragile walls of the hut. The shaman watched silently, knowing that it was too late for sorrow, too late for regret. The spirits had already made their judgment, and their hunger for vengeance could not be sated by mere words. Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted, and Tung felt the familiar chill crawl up his spine. He froze, his breath catching in his throat as the voices returned, louder now, more insistent. "Tung, Tung." They called to him, their tones a mixture of anger and sorrow, their whispers growing more frenzied as they closed in around him. Tung's heart raced in his chest, his pulse pounding in his ears as he scrambled to his feet, his back pressed against the wall, his eyes wide with terror. "They're here," he gasped, his voice trembling. "They're coming for me." The shaman did not move, his face impassive as he watched the scene unfold. "There is nothing left for you here," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the rising wind. "The spirits have come to claim what is theirs. You cannot escape them." Tung's gaze darted around the room, his breathing shallow and rapid as the shadows closed in. He could feel the weight of the spirits pressing down on him, their cold, ghostly hands reaching for him, just as they had reached for his wife, his sons, his brothers. He could hear their voices, louder now, filled with rage. "Why did you disturb us? Why did you desecrate our land?" Tung screamed, his hands flying to his ears in a futile attempt to block out the voices, but they only grew louder, more piercing, until it felt as though his skull would split open from the sound. His vision swam, dark spots dancing before his eyes as the pressure in his head built to an unbearable crescendo. And then silence. Tung blinked, his breath catching in his throat, as the room grew still. The shadows had stopped moving, the voices had ceased. For a moment, Tung dared to hope that it was over. But then, slowly the shadows on the walls began to take form. One by one, the figures of his ancestors emerged, their skeletal faces twisted in expressions of fury and betrayal. Tung backed away, his heart hammering in his chest. As the spirits closed in, their hollow eyes fixed on him. His legs gave out beneath him, and he crumpled to the floor, his hands clawing at the wood as he tried to drag himself away. But there was no escape. The first spirit reached out, its bony fingers curling around Tong's ankle, cold and unyielding. Another grasped his arm, pulling him back, dragging him toward the center of the room. He struggled, kicking and thrashing, but their grip was too strong. More hands reached for him, pulling him down, their faces looming above him, their hollow eyes staring into his soul. "You have taken from us," they whispered in unison, their voices cold and hollow. "Now we will take from you," Tong's screams echoed through the night, but they were swallowed by the wind, lost in the darkness as the spirits of his ancestors finally claimed their vengeance. Part 9. Judgment Day. The final night arrived with an eerie stillness, as though the world itself held its breath. The air inside Mr. Tom's home was suffocating, thick with the oppressive weight of the unseen forces that had tormented him for so long. The grand house, once filled with life and promise, now felt like a tomb, its halls silent, its rooms cold. Tung lay in his bed, drenched in sweat, his body weak from exhaustion, but his mind still restless, haunted by the horrors that lurked in the shadows. For weeks, sleep had become a distant memory, each night a fresh descent into terror. His dreams were no longer his own, embedded by the twisted faces of his ancestors, their skeletal hands reaching out to him, their hollow voices condemning him for the crimes he had committed. His once mighty empire was now reduced to rubble, his family torn apart by the curse he had brought upon them. And yet, the worst was still to come. Tong's body ached, his limbs heavy as though weighed down by invisible chains. His breath came in shallow gasps, his heart racing in his chest. He could feel it, the darkness closing in around him. It was inevitable now. There was no escaping it, no undoing the wrongs he had committed. The land, the fortune, the power, it all seemed meaningless now in the face of the wrath that had been unleashed. Suddenly, a soft whisper broke the suffocating silence. It was faint, barely audible, but it sent a shiver down his spine. Each time his eyes flew open, heart pounding in his chest. He tried to move, to sit up and see who or what had spoken those words, but his body betrayed him. He was frozen, paralyzed, as if some unseen force held him in place. Panic surged through him as he strained against the invisible bonds, but his muscles refused to respond. He was trapped. The shadows in the room began to shift, swirling like dark. His ancestors spoke, their voices a chilling chorus that echoed in the empty room. "You defiled our land, you desecrated our graves, you brought this upon us." And upon yourself Tong's eyes widened, tears streaming down his face as their words cut through him like knives. His lips trembled, but he could not speak. There were no words left, no excuses, no pleas for mercy. He had taken everything from them, and now they had come to take everything from him. The spirits drew closer, their skeletal hands reaching for him, cold fingers brushing against his skin. Tong's heart hammered in his chest as their touch sent icy tendrils of fear through his body. He wanted to scream, to thrash, to fight, but his body remained motionless, pinned beneath the weight of their vengeance. One by one, the spirits of his ancestors climbed onto the bed, their forms heavy and oppressive as they pressed down on him. He could feel the life being drained from his body, the cold seeping into his bones as their grip tightened around him. The darkness swirled above, growing thicker, Tung's vision blurred, his eyes darting around the room, searching for any sign of salvation. But there was none. The land, once a symbol of wealth and prosperity, was now a cursed monument to his greed. It had been meant to secure his family's future, but instead it had become the very thing that destroyed them. The spirits tightened their grip, and Tung's body convulsed, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His chest burned as if the weight of the world was pressing down on him, crushing him under its immense force. His heart pounded, a deafening drumbeat in his ears, and yet the voices of his ancestors were louder still, their words a relentless reminder of his sins. "You will never rest," they hissed, their voices rising in unison. As we cannot rest, Tung's eyes rolled back in his head, his body trembling violently as the curse reached its crescendo. He could feel the darkness pulling at him, dragging him down into a void, and then, with one final, blood-curdling scream, Tung's body was consumed by the shadows. His form disintegrated into the darkness, leaving nothing behind but an empty, cold bed. The room was silent once more, the oppressive weight of the curse lingering in the air like a stain that could never be washed away. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, the branches swaying like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. The land, once sought after for its promise of prosperity and fortune, lay undisturbed, a barren, cursed monument to the price of greed and dark powers. The final judgment had been delivered. For weeks, the villagers spoke in hushed tones about the disappearance of Mr. Tung and the strange occurrences that had plagued his family. No one dared to set foot on the land for fear that the curse might claim them next. The once prized property now stood abandoned, its grand house slowly falling into ruin, overtaken by the creeping vines and the relentless march of time. And yet, the whispers never truly faded. Some said that, on stormy nights, if you listened closely, you could still hear the voices of Tung's ancestors, their vengeful cries carried on the wind. Others swore they had seen shadowy figures wandering the land, their twisted forms searching for something that could never be returned. But no one dared to test the truth of these tales. The land, once a beacon of hope and wealth, had become a graveyard of shattered dreams, a reminder that some forces are better left undisturbed, and that the price of greed is often paid in blood. As for Mr. Tung, his name became a cautionary tale, a whispered warning passed down through generations. No one truly knew what had become of him, but those who lived near the cursed land swore that on the darkest of nights, when the wind howled and the shadows danced, they could still hear his final scream, echoing through the valley, a chilling reminder of the day judgment came for Tung.